Greetings and salutations, fellow WoW players. Today is Wednesday. It's the start of yet another week of 9.1. Unfortunately, because I wished by this point we were already well into 9.1.5, perhaps comfortably sitting in the 9.2 PTR. However, it is how it is. The timings are getting a little bit stretched for my tastes, and pretty sure for everyone's tastes by this point. However, we have to keep going with this, and what we have to go over today, since there is nothing in the game, it is, as you know, by this point, a barren wasteland of barely anyone spending time in the game except to raid log or to jump in one of the easiest Mythic Plus weeks whenever they come by. Like this one, by the way, pretty good week for Mythic Plus. What we have to go over is what is going to happen in the future, right? If the present is depressing, if the present is not looking as bright, then you might as well start dreaming for a better future. So what I'm going to be looking at, starting from today, is going to be a series of videos looking at each and every different class, how they are doing as a whole, how are the specs doing, how do the specs play, what's the difference between them, why would you want to play this class over a different one, with a window on 9.1.5 as well as eventually in the future of 9.2, because this is this is how an MMO works, and in particular WoW works. You will eventually get bored and get tired of the current content, you will sort of drop the game, and then you start seeing the news of the next patch. There is a bunch of changes, a bunch of new additions, you will get dragged in again, but this time you will want to try something new. You will want to try a new class, a new spec, reroll a new character, a new spec. So this is pretty much the biggest moment, the biggest time where players are going to go for a reroll, for a change of character, a change of main, or perhaps choose to level up a different character in between patches, when the content drought has happened, has already started, and is well underway. So as a desperate attempt to make things fresh again, as a last resort to try to get interested in the game again, you will go for playing something new, something different. So we are starting today looking at mages, and why would you want to play a mage? This is apparently a question that many people would be able to answer you, because mage is the second most popular class in the game, only beaten by hunters. But we start with mage because mage is just more interesting than hunter at the moment. They have much more variety and more interesting things to talk about compared to hunters. The first thing worth noticing when you might want to look into playing a mage is that they are quite different in the way they play. They have different types of damage profile, or they have different types, for example, of covenants they can use, which is going to become pretty valuable in 9.1.5 because you can freely swap between covenants. Right now, there are quite a few classes that are being punished by not being able to freely play different specs within the same class, because certain specs are doing super well with a specific covenant, but not really with what the different spec in the same class is doing. For example, a feral druid or a guardian druid playing night fae with a balanced druid playing Ventir, or a red paladin playing Kyrian versus a holy paladin playing Ventir. This is something quite obstructive at the moment in being able to play multiple specs, but in 9.1.5 that's gonna go away. One of the main differences, for example, is how fast do they play. It's their APM, their actions per minute. How often are you supposed to use your abilities if you're playing one of these specs? And mage is quite unique in that sense if you compare it to all the other classes and specs available, in the sense that they are very, very spread. As you can see here, Frost Mage is literally the fastest, by quite a decent margin actually, the fastest of all of the range specs in the game. Meanwhile, Arcane Mage is also by quite a big margin the slowest of all of the specs, and this includes melee DPS as well. So you can go for basically the high highs of playing fast or the low lows of playing very slowly within the same class. To top this all off, you have Fire Mage, which is comfortably in the middle. So even just by this metric, you would be choosing a pretty diverse class, which allows you to change up the pace of the specs you want to play, just how fast you want to go. This can influence what you want to play. It can influence your mood. You know, sometimes you want to play like a schizo going at 200 miles an hour, or sometimes you want to go in slow mode, clicking a couple of buttons every 10 seconds and have a nice day. Mage is a pretty good example of this type of different play styles available to you. Whereas, for example, if you wanted to play Druids, they were all pretty much on the fast side of specs, whereas if you wanted to play Warlocks, they are all on the slow side of the specs. Mage, on the other hand, is much more varied. Another thing that differs between the three specs is their damage profile. So how exactly are they gonna do their damage? Even though they play fast or slow or in the middle, the damage profile can be different. Fire Mage and Arcane Mage are much closer to each other compared to Frost. Both Fire and Arcane have some pretty powerful cooldowns that they can build their damage profile around. This is going to translate into having some pretty strong single target burst damage and also a decent to strong AoE burst damage that they can have with their cooldowns from Arcane Power and even Presence of Mind to Combustion, with the pretty much complete opposite, which is Frost Mage, that doesn't really have a cooldown. Even in this current form, Frost Mage's Icy Veins has been turned into a near permanent buff, so they don't even have a huge cooldown to use. They just do their damage. Very consistent, very straightforward. You will never be expected to do more damage in a certain phase than in another, because your damage will stay more or less the same, whereas for Fire and for Arcane, there is much more onus on you, basically to know what you're doing, to know how to line up your cooldowns, how to line up for or start, for example, saving on your charges of Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames before your big burst, etc, etc. So they do require some more experience, some more knowledge of the encounters or of the size of the pools of Mythic Plus, for example, whereas Frost Mage can just go. Frost Mage can just continue going. It will keep getting its procs, its Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost continuously. Doesn't really matter. You can just go and perform the same more or less consistently. And this type of difference comes from the main point, the main damage profile of the three specs, which is the fact that Frost Mage does significantly more AoE than these two other specs, Arcane and Fire, up to 50%, sometimes even 70% more. The problem is that when you look at these sims, these are over time, over a long period of time. And as we said, Frost Mage has a very good sustained damage. So in raid encounters, this does not play out as well. You know, when we go and look at the biggest AoE encounters like Soul Render, like Painsmith when the adds are spawning, or Fate Scribe when the adds are spawning, Kel'Thuzad when the adds are spawning, we see that Frost Mage is very low. They are even losing sometimes to Arcane Mage or Fire Mage, but they are supposed to be doing top AoE damage, right? They are. The problem is, mobs in raid encounters die too fast. AoE elements in raid encounters are very short. They don't leave the time for Frost Mage to maximize their damage profile, which is sustained damage, continuous damage. As we said, they have no burst cooldowns, they have no big blasts of instant damage, they have to do their continued damage, which is why they do much better, they perform much better in Mythic Plus, where you can significantly extend the duration of your AoE, depending on how big the pool is, depending on the level of your key. If it's fortified, right, the mobs are gonna last for much longer than they would last in a mythic raiding encounter, so Frost Mage has a much easier time shining in their strongest part of their damage profile, which is consistent AoE. Even cleave on 2 to 3 targets, they are still doing very well compared to Arcane and Fire, who can do nicely but only in short periods, only if they can translate that into their burst cooldowns. Outside of that, they have a much bigger weakness. Another thing worth mentioning is their popularity and their current situation, because believe it or not, one of the main things that people are going to keep in mind when choosing a class sometimes is not going to be how fun the certain specs are. Sometimes it's not going to be if it fits their damage profile, like for example they want to play an AoE spec, so they are looking for AoE specs only, or sometimes it's not even going to be whether or not the spec plays very fast or very slow, or if it's melee or ranged. Sometimes they will be interested in, am I actually going to get a spot in a group? Am I gonna be wanted? Is the spec at least not survival hunter tier? So when it comes to the popularity of Mage, you do have Fire and you do have Frost. They are both pretty healthy. Fire, as you have been following my videos recapping the raid, Fire has recently passed Frost Mage in popularity in Mythic raids. It's still lagging behind in Heroic, of course, because Heroic doesn't have as many min-maxers as Mythic, so there are still more players in Heroic playing Frost, but both Fire and Frost Mage are popular in the raid. When it comes to Mythic Plus, it is slightly reversed. It is Frost Mage who is still pretty popular, and also the most used Mage spec when it comes to high keys, but Fire Mage has been rising quite a bit. The only one that's left out, the black sheep of the class for the moment, has been Arcane since the start of the expansion. Arcane is amongst the lowest when it comes to participation and performance for both raids and Mythic Plus. So that could actually lead certain players to make a different choice, because they are not safe enough. They don't feel safe playing Arcane. Perhaps they like Arcane more than Frost and Fire, but they're like, yeah, but then people are gonna decline me. People are not gonna want Arcane because it's underplayed or something. So it is worth mentioning that at the moment, Fire and Frost remain more popular, and strictly speaking, it's Fire Mage that has been on the rise in the past few weeks. Pretty much ever since their legendary Sun King's Blessing was hotfixed, Fire Mage has been on a rise. Now, another thing, and the reason why it is worth doing this type of overview about the classes come 9.1.5 and the future content patch of 9.2 is, of course, what is going to change for these specs. And what's going to change is the fact that you can play multiple covenants, different covenants, and swap amongst them with no real negative, no real hurdle. So this can be a buff. This can be a hidden buff for certain classes that are able, even now, could be able to play multiple covenants, could be able to play certain boss fights as Fire and Night Fae, and then certain other boss fights as Arcane, but they have to be Kyrian. Right now they cannot. Meanwhile, in 9.1.5 and then 9.2, this is going to be unlocked for them. So it's going to be pretty valuable if you wanted to play Mage, if Mage had the option to change multiple combinations of specs and covenants, because you will be able to do so. And perhaps some other specs won't. Some other specs will be locked in a certain covenant, not being able to maximize their power depending on the activity you want to do. And Mage is also, because of this, in a pretty good spot. Because at the moment, Fire Mage players are Night Fae, Arcane players are Kyrian, and Frost Mage players are Venthyr. So already you have a triple split. You have 3 different specs for 3 different covenants, which is already good in the future prospect of 9.1.5. Look at Warlock. All 3 Warlock specs playing Night Fae. How exciting are you as a Warlock that you can freely spec to different covenants in 9.1.5? Sure, you will try because it's something new, so it gives you something to do, but right now, as a Mage, you already know you will have the option to play different specs with their respective best performing covenant, which is a nice thing. And this can change even within the same specs, because, for example, Arcane Mage is playing Kyrian, sure, but AoE, if you're playing Arcane Mage, is technically better if you're playing Venthyr, which is something you can't really do right now. It is something a Frost Mage could do, because Frost Mage is already Venthyr, so they could respec to Arcane while still being Venthyr and do better AoE. But at the same time, a Frost Mage would perform better in AoE if they were Necrolord, which none of the 3 specs are currently playing, while at the same time a Fire Mage who is playing Night Fae and has been playing Night Fae for the entirety of the expansion is technically better as a Venthyr when playing purely single target. This type of diversity, which is very confusing, some might even say a clusterfuck, is going to be very good for you for 9.1.5 and 9.2, because it's going to give you a ton of different things to try out, a ton of different avenues to play the specs, perhaps even changing different legendaries based on the covenant and spec combo you're going for, which is a healthy thing, particularly for a pure DPS class that only has one goal in mind, which is doing DPS perhaps you were playing a red paladin and you had no intention of playing a tank or a healer, so all of this diversity for you, if it happens to paladin, you not really care about it, because all you care about is red, since that's the only spec you're playing. But for a mage, who is a pure DPS class with 3 available specs, is actually pretty important that you can find this much viability amongst the different combinations of specs and covenants. Now, we have said for the 3 different specs that one of them is very slow, one of them is very fast, and one of them is in the middle. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that one spec is better than the other. The fact that Arcane is slow and Frost is very fast doesn't really mean that Frost is better or plays better than Arcane. Different people are going to have different tastes in how fast or slow they want their spec to be. The same goes for, how effectively are they going to play out their spec. When we look at Fire Mage, which is our middle of the pack, Fire Mage is deceptively so in the middle, because in their short windows of combustion, they are Frost Mage level. They are amongst the quickest of the specs. But then, outside of the combustion window, they go all the way down to Arcane level, amongst the slowest of the specs. So it's not that Fire is in the middle of APM, of actions per minute, because they just do an average amount of button presses. It's the opposite. It's very unbalanced in when and how many buttons they have to press. This is your Fire Mage during combustion. They click combustion and they deplete their charges of Fire Blast, their charges of Phoenix Flames to do their entire combo within combustion. Then they will use their legendary, Sun King's Blessing, to hard cast a Pyroblast and get into essentially another shorter window of pseudo combustion. But after that, it's, it's downtime time, because it's just gonna be waiting for your cooldowns to come back without too much interactive playstyle. You can still keep an eye out for when Hot Streak hits 2 charges for your instant Pyroblast, but for the most time it's just spamming Fireball, which is very slow, like Arcane Mage, and also not that entertaining. Frost Mage is quite different. If you didn't like this type of burst playstyle of Fire, the fastest of the range spec in the game is actually very straightforward. So it's not like Fire. They don't have super high, short moments of fast button presses followed by a long period of downtime. It's very, very even and sustained, just like their type of damage. You can see, for example, that this is the start of their so-called burst window. They have their Ventir ability, they have their Icy Veins, they are putting down Rune of Power, and it is still just more or less Frostbolt, Ice Lance when you get your procs, and Flurry when you get the instant cast of Flurry. Repeat. This is Frost Mage outside of the burst window. It is exactly the same. They are not changing whether or not they have their cooldowns up, whether or not they have their cooldowns down. The rotation and the frequency of the buttons they are pressing is not really changing. It's a continuous rotation of the same 3 abilities over and over. Of course, Frost Mage is even more, perhaps, dependent on procs, random procs of Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze, which means when you're kind of unlucky and it doesn't happen, the procs just don't seem to come out, you're gonna have to face something like this. Yes, this is the nature of a Frost Mage. And then you have, lastly, when it comes to the rotation and how they play, you have Arcane, which is our slowest of the specs, not just of Mage, but of the entire game. Arcane, since they went Kyrian and they went playing Radiant Spark, which is the Kyrian ability, on a 30-second cooldown, has essentially been fluctuating between the window where they activate Radiant Spark and they hardcast Arcane Blasts, followed by the downtime period of just channeling Arcane Missiles over and over. Once the 30 seconds have passed and your Radiant Spark is coming off cooldown, you can go back to dropping down the Spark and then using your Arcane Blasts, and then back to using Arcane Missiles. It is a very similar continued rotation as the Frost Mage, so even though they can avail themselves of some pretty powerful cooldowns like Arcane Power, like Presence of Mind, it still doesn't change too much of what they want to do with their rotation, which is worth pointing out because their damage profile is similar to a fire mage's. So maybe even though you like the burst and the big numbers that you can do in a short period like a fire mage can, you maybe like a more consistent rotation, a more reliable rotation you can do every time. So for you, it would be better to go Arcane. Perhaps, on the other hand, you like an even more streamlined version of that rotation, which doesn't even have to focus on big cooldown usage, in which case Frost Mage would be the best. Lastly, if you do like the feeling of playing around a cooldown, you know, the feeling of seeing the cooldowns come back, preparing for them, etc., then Fire Mage remains easily the better choice for mage players. So there can be differences within this type of playstyle that might appeal to certain players or not. That's going to be up to you. It's going to be personal preference. What isn't going to be personal preference is what you're going to be closing down the video with after having talked about the 3 different specs. The more important part as to why you would want to give an eye out to Mage, trying out Mage for 9.1.5, getting it ready to go for 9.2, whichever your timeline is going to be about. The real point is that this tier Mage has not been up to the standards of flavor of the month and most popular spec amongst the Mage class. Mage has gotten used over the years to being a very popular spec, whichever was the flavor of the month at the time, but this tier we didn't really have this. Fire Mage dropped heavily from Castonatria, which was when it was ruling. It was the most popular spec in raid encounters, it was the most used DPS spec in Mythic Plus, but it was nerfed. They entered this 9.1 patch significantly weaker. They have gotten a little bit stronger over time, they have been rising over time, but they're still nowhere near being flavor of the month. Despite being buffed, both Frost and Arcane have not become flavor of the month. Arcane is lagging a little bit behind, but it is still a fine spec, and Frost, while being the most popular mage spec in Mythic Plus and one of the more used specs at very high keys, it is still pretty nicely balanced. It does still have some glaring weaknesses. It is nowhere near one of the better performing specs in raid encounters, for example, so even if it is doing well in Mythic Plus, it still has the downside of being mediocre in raid encounters. And this is telling, this is telling because very rarely do we have an expansion where Mage as a whole does not have at least one spec as flavor of the month for an entire tier. So I think the bonus of Shadowlands was played in 9.1. The bonus of no FOTM mages has been played for 9.1, so we are bound to have a resurgence of one of the 3 mage specs as we get closer to 9.2, which is why if you care about this type of angle, it would be pretty wise, statistically speaking, to go and play a mage. Now, with this overview of Mage, we can stop for the day. I am going to be accepting some suggestions at which classes do you want to see featured next, to have their specs compared, to see how they have been doing, how they might be doing in 9.1.5 with their freely available covenants. You can lay down your reasonings behind why it could be interesting to look at these classes first. Eventually we will look at all of them, but if you have some good points, some good ideas, I might make them jump the queue and put them out first. So, thank you guys anyways for watching the video. If you have enjoyed this type of content and want to support the channel, on top of leaving a comment down in the comment section, you can like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. Now, after this usual disclaimer, we can stop. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, finally long pants and woolly socks. It starts to feel nice again when it's cold. Great season.